That's it. Okay, Andrew, it's great to have this opportunity to talk with you about a subject which I feel is so important, spirituality and leadership. And I know that you're taking a leading role in this area of what does I feel a very important development in organizations at this time. My understanding is that your career started off as a lawyer, and you were a lawyer for 7 years in New York.
Los Angeles.
Oh, in Los Angeles, I beg your pardon. Thank you for correcting me. But for the last 25 years, you have been working globally in the areas of consultancy, training, mentoring, anything I've left out there. Anyway, that's pretty much the area you've been working in. And I'm curious to know, what are some of the countries that you've worked in?
Some of the countries that I've worked in, I've been fortunate. A lot of those countries have come to me. So I've worked in, I don't know, probably about 15 countries, nothing too exotic, but compared to some of my colleagues. But I'm fortunate in that I've worked with many global teams where I might work with a team in the UK, for example, that has 6 countries represented, but it's not that I've gone to Egypt or Sri Lanka or whatever to work with people. But I'm fortunate that I've worked in a number of different engagements with global teams. And also I work at and through the Wharton School here in Philadelphia, and the whole world comes to Wharton in terms of where people's roots are. So I've been lucky that way. I do enjoy the travel part of my work, but I'm glad that I don't have to go quite everywhere.
Particularly in pandemic times, right? That's useful, you don't have to travel. So what I'm curious to know is, how have you been inspired by the different cultures and different people that you've worked with, and what have you learned from them? Because working with different cultures, it's a different approach, presumably, when you're working with different cultures.
Oh, definitely, especially as a white, straight majority American. I was an international relations, international business and economics major undergrad. I wrote for the International Law Journal in law school. I've always had this part of my mind and my heart. I did a study abroad as an undergrad that changed my life, just, living where I was for a period of time. And I think it changes, it impacts the approach because we can take nothing for granted. So on the one hand, there's it's always different. And there's something that's delightfully surprising when I'll ask a question or someone will pipe up with something in a meeting and I'll be like, I never would have thought of that. And I could see that she never would have thought of that either by the look on her face. So on the one hand, it's always different. And on the other hand, there are certain things that are quite universal, as we know. So it's yes, and it's both of those things are true in terms of culturally diverse groups.
So that sounds like it's been very enriching for you and assisted.
Oh, for me, absolutely, I love it.
Yeah, and I love many things are universal, and then there are certain characteristics which are distinctive. So do you have to adapt when there are things that are not familiar to you, or how do you handle the differences that show up?
Well, so that's a great question. So let me give some examples. I'm coaching a woman now who is the CEO of a telecom company in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. She is, not surprisingly, managing issues of work-life balance, such as it is. Very competitive, very successful, very driven person who is at risk of burning herself out, and with some consequences to the family. And the way that her mindset is, I think, quite different than certainly the typical American or Western European mindset in terms of how she thinks of herself as a mom, as a woman, as a leader, what she's entitled to, what she's, just how she views herself is very much influenced by her culture, as it's true everywhere. But in terms of what I might, I don't do too much advising as a coach. I'm more inviting and inquiry, et cetera. But I need to be very sensitive to the fact that she grew up a certain way, and that's her culture, and it's not for me or anyone else to say as an American, you're entitled to. It's like, no, 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 no. That's not what this is about. And similarly, I'm working with another client now who's in India, who's got a similar challenge, who's dealing with issues of hierarchy, which are treated differently there as compared to how it is here. There's just things that are different that I face all the time, and it keeps me on my toes because I really have to do a check down in my head before I ask a question, based upon what I know. And then there's other times, honestly, where I don't know. So I was on a call this morning I mentioned earlier, with a group from Europe, and there was a gentleman in my breakout group I was working with closely, from the Netherlands, and he was talking about how, well, as compared to France, and there was a gentleman in the room from France. It's always amazing to me how places that are so close together can have such different cultures. And he was talking about his directness as an attribute of his Dutchness. He said, and my colleague who he was talking about in this discussion, he said, is even more Dutch than I am, and that was his phrase, not mine.
Yeah.
But the notion of how appropriate is it to raise certain things that might be a little bit more personal in the spirit of deepening relationships. That's what the conversation was about. How appropriate is it to go there in that culture with two men born and raised in that culture? And I don't know. So it's more of I don't presume to know. I could research it, but even if I researched it and I found that that's a typical trait, I'm not going to presume that's true for him. So how can I ask questions to invite him to think about that, while recognizing that, his lens may be very different than mine is, and that's to be respected, not to be, challenged. Invited to challenge, I suppose, but not to be opposed.
Yes.
Or questioned.
And actually, this is a question I was going to have later, but I'm going to dodge around here, because in order to open conversations, people have to feel safe. And it sounds like you have the sensitivity to recognize when you hold in a certain way and when you can put a question and how to put it and so on. So you've gained that. I would have thought that, I call it a skill really, to know how to bring people forward in a way they feel safe, because you're not going to get good conversation unless people feel safe.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be a good conversation, and it's not going to be helpful to them.
No,
I mean,
exactly.
my role is to be of service to that person or that team. But if people don't feel safe to speak up, it's not going to have much value.
Yeah, okay, I really get that. I have one of my notes is that a lot of the ideas about leadership have been derived from the military, which is a very sort of organized, they have an objective they have to fulfill. And it tends to be quite a masculine kind of approach, the military style of leadership. And it seems to have worked by and large because companies have produced their profits and all that kind of a thing. And so when you talk about spirituality, that's almost comes across as being a bit soft and a bit woo-woo, and we understand the military because it's organized, and things, we know where we are and so on. With spirituality, it can be a little more unknown and uncertain. And so I'm curious about that. And in a way, you've addressed it because of the sensitivity you've developed in working with people of different cultures. But that could be people in the same room, but are different. So they could be the same culture, but very different. So it sounds to me that you've really, what you're talking about with leadership, spirituality and leadership, is the sensitivity required that you have to bring forward the best results or the best outcomes for people that you're working with. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. So the conversation begins with some version of what are the goals or the objectives of people in the room. The answer to that question is going to be some level of a fork in the road in terms of what we choose, right? Yeah. It's like, what would you like for dinner? That's going to determine what I'm going to cook. So what are we doing? Are we forming a team that doesn't know one another and we need to build trust? Are we responding to a challenge where we have a threat in front of us and we need to mobilize quickly? Is it a new leader stepping into a group with people who already know each other? There needs to be some level of communication and credibility, earned or something like that. Is it a group that may be looking to develop a skill and I'm there to support them to develop a particular skill? So we start with what's the group there, what's the learning objective? Hopefully I know that before I get in the room. With groups, that's usually the case. With individuals in a coaching situation, which is where a lot of my work is now, especially in the pandemic, as there's been less travel and more one-on-one coaching virtually. Sometimes I don't know what the issue is. And I may have an agenda from a previous conversation or a takeaway or some follow-ups. I have some notes in front of me that say, okay, well, this is what we talked about last time. But then sometimes I'll ask the question, what would be the most useful way to use your time today? And I can get something that I really don't know what it is.
Right.
But again, it starts with the question of what is your objective, or what would you like to be different?
Okay. All right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I have a series of little questions that, yes. So this is really asking you, what has drawn you to this endeavor? Why is it important to you? What do you hope to accomplish? You already said some of that. And how does spirituality in leadership add value to the enterprise, to stakeholders, to employees and customers? And in terms of adding value, I'm also thinking about results, financial results, that kind of thing. So
yeah,
keep doing that.
Yeah. So great. That's a great series of questions. There's a lot of buzzwords flying around, especially in the business world and the corporate world these days, as there always are. Jargon is like frisbees, and they're flying around all over the place. It's very hard to get and keep good people. In times of pandemic, people are in certain industries in particular, their attrition rates are very high. People are being poached. People can work from anywhere. It's a lot easier to take a job for this company I really want to work with, or this partnership I really want to work with that's on the other side of the world, because everybody's working virtually anyway. So and some of my clients have, to their credit, have said, hey, we really want a different type of employee. We're going to hire people that are 1,000 miles away, and as long as they can cope with the time zone, it's all good. So there's a lot of that. So the notion of developing some level of consistency, building a team culture, the ways of how we work, building team norms, a sense of cohesion and trust on a team is a little more difficult because the pieces are moving right now. Just in terms of who's in and who's out is one piece. Then there's, of course, what I would propose or offer as unprecedented levels of uncertainty. What's happening with businesses? Are we in business? Are we not in business? Are we getting back to normal or not? Whatever normal is. Are we going to be acquired? Are we going to be split off? Are we going to whatever? I mean, just who knows what's happening in the global economy right now, which is not to say that everything is very depressed. It's just very uncertain.
Yeah.
So even though, things may be growing, no one knows exactly what's growing. And because of that, there's greater levels of uncertainty, which is another thing that is leadership's responsibility to address. Those are two things so the comings and goings and the impact on teams and the levels of uncertainty and the resultant levels of stress on individuals, but also decision-making that leadership is responsible for, are both things that I would argue are benefit from dimensions of spirituality, as I would call it. So, for example, a leader who has some type of a practice that enables her to clear her mind, such as meditation, or perhaps prayer or something like that, if people want to go in a religious side, it doesn't need to be. But I often make the point, importantly, that I'm not talking about spiritual beliefs. I'm talking about spiritual dimensions of people. So, for example, loving, acceptance, caring, forgiveness are spiritual dimensions of human beings. I, as far as I know, just about every religion I've seen, if not everyone that I've seen, values those qualities. They have different paths to get to those points. And then, of course, there's ways to reach those qualities or dimensions and develop those dimensions that have nothing to do with religion. That's fine. My point is that those things would be labeled as spiritual in many different frameworks or models. Those things would be labeled as spiritual. And it's the application of those principles to some of the challenges that we're talking about that, for me, is what spirituality in leadership is about. So a person who has honed those abilities to be accepting, for example, is someone who can hold space for an employee who's freaking out a lot better than someone who has not developed those attributes. Somebody who's altruistic or service oriented, or dare I say loving in a broad definition of that, in non-emotional, more than emotional, beyond emotional way, can listen better, can help solve problems better, cannot be as reactive as somebody else would be. And somebody who, for example, like I mentioned earlier, somebody who is a meditator, whether they do it because that's part of their church service, or they do it because it keeps their blood pressure down, is going to make better decisions. Like research has shown that even small amounts of regular meditation clear our heads and reduce the impact of bias in decision making, which makes perfect sense, because one thing that meditation does in the clearest non-academic verbiage, it clears our heads. It helps us be present. And so when we're making a decision based on what's in front of us. And we're not going to be biased by what did we decide yesterday? Or, who really wants something different? I'm going to be unduly influenced by something that's not really the data. So I'm better able to make a decision based on the data. If my head is more clear, meditation is one way to do that. That's a dimension of spirituality in an important leadership activity.
Okay. And what I'm getting to also is that it has a positive impact on the bottom line. So companies are going to be more productive, more effective, produce better client relationships, etc.
Yeah, we make better decisions. We're more successful in the marketplace. If we can keep the people we want to keep and not have regrettable losses in our workforce, we'll be more successful.
Got it. Because I think that's the important thing. If people are talking about an organization, it's there to function, to survive. And particularly when times are uncertain, they need to have all these things on their side to produce value in the world, to produce results, to keep their bottom line going well. Because that's why they're paying you. Because you are helping them to be more productive.
Absolutely. I mean, but there's a lovely marriage here. It's, if people are engaged, I mean, we've seen the numbers and statistics and points about engaged. If people are engaged, they're more productive.
Yeah.
If people are connected to the people with whom they're working, if there's a level of trust among people on a team, you get more from that team. I contribute more to my team if I believe in the people and trust the individuals that I'm working with. Everybody wins. That's good for me, it's good for the team, and it's good for the profit, for the bottom line.
And I'm also getting, when you talk about trust, I'm reminded of the Brené Brown vulnerability and the importance of feeling safe enough to trust. And I've been playing with an idea of where you've got a safe witness who's listening. You're building intimacy in a close relationship, but you're building trust, that ability to be open and not feel you've got to shut down, which is one of the limitations of a military organized leadership, in my perception anyway, that there can be a question of threat, and where there's an absence of threat, where there's safety, and the kind of spiritual values you're talking about create a safe environment in which people can expand, can be more creative, can produce better results.
Yeah. And I would never suggest that I know much about leadership in the military. But from the people with whom I've worked around this, there is often a very high level of trust in the military. I know that this person is going to risk their life for me. But that doesn't mean that there's safety in terms of offering an alternative point of view when we're making a decision. So things are a little bit different in that model, for sure, I think.
Yeah. Well, my father was in the Royal Navy, so he was a very soft-hearted man. But I understand his role was kind of different than spirituality in leadership. So yes, I think you've already talked about this, but I'm interested in that whole idea of opening the conversation. And I'm curious about, and I think you've already spoken to it, but how you open it, and why is conversation of value and important? What is the value in conversation?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think conversation enables us to know who we are and to know who each other is. Without conversation, we don't know what we're dealing with. We don't know who's in the room. We don't know what's important to them.
Yeah.
We don't know how to best support them. There's a whole lot of things that reason conversation is essential, at least with people in the workplace, which is where I am.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. And so often conversations are good conversations are neglected. They're not curated, right? They're just assumed that, okay, well, we had a good conversation, bad conversation, it is what it is. No. There are ways you can influence that conversation and change the tone and tenor of the conversation.
If that's what you mean by curate the conversation. Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So a lot of my work is helping leaders figure out how uniquely for them, and there are common patterns, but uniquely for them, what are the conversations they need to have, and how do they have?
Right. I love that. I'm all for conversation myself, but I like that you've described that. You also talk about purpose. You've written about that. So I'm curious to know how you see your purpose in spirituality and leadership. What is the value it has for you? What is the value you contribute to make this endeavor fulfilling for those involved? You've kind of addressed that, but what more can you say about purpose?
Well, purpose is what connects us to it's an individual expression of meaning.
Okay.
And purpose is thrown around a lot. It's a little bit like one of those frisbees that's flying around.
Sure.
But the important thing is to connect with what's most fulfilling about what I do. What are the most fulfilling dimensions of the work that I do? And if it's not fulfilling, what am I reaching for based on what has meaning for me?
Right.
So, for example, to support leaders in the workspace to be more fulfilled and satisfied and successful is part of what my purpose is, or what part of my mission is.
Right.
I came to that because I started in a very different place where I really wasn't too particularly concerned with people. And so I think I in part realized what I really wanted to do, because I knew that I wasn't doing it. Had an opportunity to look over and go, oh, I like what's growing over there. Maybe I'll give that a try. But I will sometimes facilitate conversations that are about very clearly and explicitly identifying what is our purpose, what is our collective purpose as a working team, or what is my purpose as an individual leader or an individual contributor. What is my purpose? And that's largely a question of what is fulfilling for me and what has meaning in my work. It's not mysterious and mystical. It's usually a pretty practical conversation, and people, including me, people including me, generally like to talk about that. Not that they want to tell the world or ramble on about it, but they like to be clear about it. I want to be clear about what my purpose is, because the clearer I can be, the clearer any of us can be about our purpose, the more likely we already get it, right? Yeah. It's a bit like creating an ideal scene or painting a picture or seating on something. If we put something out there with more clarity, we're more likely to get it. And it resounds in us. It's like hitting the tuning fork a certain way when we have that sense of purpose. And that could be capital P purpose and the clouds part and the angels sing, or it could be just, it's directionally, yes, it's more of this. And sometimes that's as clear as someone can be. I don't think it's here. I think it's more of this. Great. Let's go in this direction.
So a person who is maybe feeling their purpose isn't quite being fulfilled in their current role, that they have the flexibility to say, actually, I'd rather be a little bit more engaged in this area. Is that a possibility? And also the other word that comes to mind is attitude. Is it possible that people can not adapt their attitude, but be flexible in terms of they're in a team, they are appreciated and they're valued, but their purpose isn't quite being fulfilled? Could they move within that environment? I'm not being very clear about it, but do you kind of get what I'm saying?
I think I get what you're saying, but let me respond to that from another angle. From a leader point of view, I want to know who those people are on my team and what those other areas are that they're trying to satisfy.
Right.
And that back to my listening and my awareness and my holding space for people, because the more I'm aware of what those people want to do, the more I can do my best. I mean, I can only do what I can do with the resources I have, et cetera. The more I can do my best to give that to them.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It's essentially about motivation. What motivates people? Yeah. Some people are motivated to learn technology. Some people are motivated to play on the big juicy project. Some people are motivated to have more personal time because they're more introverted. Some people are motivated by money. So if I understand what those things are, I'm more likely I can satisfy them. Not guaranteed, but more likely.
And what I'm hearing there is the awareness, the leader having awareness, which is also a spiritual quality as I understand it, that you have the awareness of what makes the people around you tick and how you can support them in fulfilling what they're...
Which circles back to the extent that you can do that as a leader, your people are going to be more engaged, they're going to be more productive, they're going to be less likely to leave.
Yes.
And so they are more satisfied and more engaged and more present and available and productive, and the organization does better.
Okay.
Because who do you want on the phone with your customers? Yeah. Right? Which employee do you want on the phone with your customers? The one who's engaged and is spending a considerable, if not all of their job, a considerable percentage of their time in their work is fulfilling to them. Somebody who's working under a leader who isn't paying attention to them and is only concerned about money, etc.
Got it. So I think you've already answered these questions. It's how does spirituality and leadership add value to individuals, to organizations? I think you've pretty much covered that, but is there anything else that you haven't said about it? I think you've covered it pretty well.
The other thing that I'd say about it is that for those of us, and there's a lot of us, and it doesn't mean that there's a them, I don't mean us and them, but for those of us who are focused personally on developing these types of qualities ourselves.
Yes.
I think it's important to make the connection that these types of attributes and energies are really quite needed and necessary. So there's a benefit to saying, hey, no, keep it up. Let's keep focusing on bringing ourselves into greater balance and reducing our stress and being more open-hearted and being more accepting, because it's more productive. Yeah. And it helps everyone in our circle, whether I'm formally a leader with somebody reporting up into me, or even just I'm the low person on the ladder, but I can influence other people. And the person who's bringing more of these attributes is valued in the room. Yes. Even if she's not the leader, but I want her on my team. Yes. Something about her. She brings a certain openness. She brings a certain positivity. I want her on my team. So there's that connection to be made. And that's one of the things I love about this conversation.
Yes, and I totally get that the person who seems like the lesser often has a great deal to contribute if they're invited and they feel a part of the operation.
That's right. Well, and leadership comes from all over. I mean, it may or may not in certain dimensions of the military, to come back to your point. But again, not my space. I don't want to presume to judge that in any way. But absolutely, leadership comes from all levels. And now when innovation is prized and worshipped in organizations, innovation ideas can come from anywhere.
Yes. And you need to be open to them. And what's more, invite them. Final question. What do you most love about the work that you do?
In my work, I get to help people be more fulfilled. I get to help people be happier. And I connect that to their work in the world. And I think that in our work is where we're often very challenged, very threatened, but also very fulfilled. Yeah. People set goals and reach goals in their work. And the workplace can sometimes be can appear or can be a very unfriendly place. Hopefully not physically threatening, but it can threaten our identities, it can threaten our egos or whatever it might be. And I get to help people navigate that and win and succeed in that space. And it's incredibly fulfilling.
Yep, that's your purpose then. Love it. Great. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to add, Andrea? I really appreciate your responses to my questions.
No, thank you. I appreciate the time and the opportunity to talk about it.
Okay, so I'm going to see what I can to switch off the recording right now.